Well, I believe I should be the next governor of Louisiana because we have to continue the incredible progress we've made over the last 4 years. I would invite your attention to the $2 billion budget deficit that I inherited, and then the ability that we had to come together, Republicans, Democrats, and independents, and make the tough choices necessary to right the ship. Put that budget deficit in our rearview mirror, and 3 consecutive years now we've run surpluses. It was hard work, but it's very worthwhile, and our state's doing much better as a result. And we are able now to make strategic new investments in things like education, where this year we gave the first teacher pay raise in 10 years, in higher education, where for the first time in a decade we've had a net new investment, and we increased early childhood education by 20 years since last year too. So the opportunity that we have as a state to continue to move forward is one that we can't afford to lose out on, and I believe that that's why I need to be reelected as governor. And if you just look at the progress that we've made in terms of economic development, with 165 major economic development project wins since I've been governor, more than $40 billion of capital investment, and the fact that we are creating 34,000 new jobs and retaining more than 31,000 existing jobs all across the state of Louisiana. The performance of our economy, along with the stability we were able to achieve with the budget situation, has allowed us to get to a much, much better place than we were at any point over the previous 8 years before I became governor. And the last thing we need to do right now is to entertain some of the same old tried and failed policies that actually ran our state deep into the ditch to begin with. And so being reelected governor is the best thing for our state if we want to continue to move forward, make strategic new investments, and create more opportunity and prosperity here in Louisiana, all over our state, including right here in Northwest Louisiana as well. Well, we've already taken a lot of steps, and we're being more aggressive, more creative in funding infrastructure projects in Louisiana than we've ever been in the past. For example, I just signed into law a bill that will have a net new injection of $700 million in transportation infrastructure when we bond out the BP settlement proceeds that were coming to the state. That'll happen next year. 100 million of those dollars will go to the I-49 extension right here in Shreveport, for example. Critically important, but it wouldn't have happened were we not able to work with the legislature, make the funds available, and then agree on an allocation by region. Secondly, we're also doing things like making sure that we're taking advantage of opportunities such as the Garvey bonds, where for the first time in our state's history, we're bonding out 10% of our federal transportation trust fund revenue over 12 years in order to do large-scale capacity projects that quite honestly wouldn't be possible otherwise. That is exactly how we found the $72 million to do the new interchange at Barksdale Air Force Base off of I-20, critically important for Northwest Louisiana, for the state of Louisiana. This has been on the state's highway priority program list for many, many years. It wasn't done because the funding wasn't available, but it was also on the number one request of the Air Force to the state of Louisiana. So taking advantage of these opportunities, we just announced that the state of Louisiana intercepted $76 million that was being returned to the federal government by states that have received those allocations this year, but were unable to obligate those funds before the end of the fiscal year. We were able to intercept those because we had obligated all the funds that we had received, because we had the local match necessary in order to draw them down, and we had the shovel-ready projects as well. So we're going to continue to lean forward and do everything that we can to be proactive, creative in securing more transportation dollars, because quite frankly, we have a huge backlog across the state of Louisiana. We have for a very long time. One of the first things that I did has paid tremendous dividends, and that was the state police was getting $72 million a year out of the Transportation Trust Fund. We cut them to zero. and that allows $72 million more for transportation infrastructure, and we doubled the Port Priority Program from $20 million a year to $40 million a year, and with the most recent budget, that's a total of $80 million more that have been invested in our ports, including the ports right here in Shreveport-Bossier. Well, the same answer is the one I gave here a couple of weeks ago when I met with the officials here at the Chamber. This project is incredibly important. We know it's important for this region and for the state, and we now have the non-federal match necessary to move forward. We have to work with our federal partners to secure the funding for the remainder of the project, which would be in the neighborhood of about $800 million. But it is critically important that we have the funding lined up. We do. It'll come from the bond proceeds that I mentioned before from the BP settlement being bonded out. It won't be available for a few years because the legislation that created the revenue also gave first call to other projects. But that does give us time to work with the Metropolitan Planning Commission, get the record of decision, which is the exact route that the intercity connector will take, and that will allow us the time necessary to do all of the preparatory work and then receive the funds. But working with the administration in Washington, but also our congressional delegation and the U.S. Department of Transportation is going to be critically important to secure the funding necessary to go with the $100 million that we have here in Louisiana. But I was happy to sign that bill into law, knowing that it had the $100 million for the intercity connector. We're going to work with the local legislative delegation to ensure that it moves forward just as expeditiously as possible. And this is, by the way, how we're going to execute all of the projects to be funded by the BP revenue that we're going to bond out. Well, first of all, the $2 billion budget deficit was the largest in the history of our state. And it was extremely difficult to deal with because over 50% of the discretionary state general fund was in deficit when I walked into office. That's the money we used to have matched for healthcare dollars. That's how we run higher education. That's how we run our prisons and our foster care program, for example. Those level of cuts that would have been required to deal with that deficit strictly through cuts were absolutely not something that was going to be tolerated by the people of Louisiana or by the legislature. So we worked really hard to get the 2/3 vote that we needed to get in the House and in the Senate, which, as you know, is Republican majority in both of those chambers, in order to stabilize our state. Because we did that stabilization and through a balanced approach of cuts, of savings, and of revenue, we've actually created the stability we need, and now the economic growth we have in Louisiana is also producing surplus dollars. And I will just simply tell you, a surplus is far preferable to a deficit. You're going to have one or the other. And a $300 million surplus is the same as budgeting for $1 and having $1.01 at the end of the day. But you'd much rather that penny be on the positive side rather than on the negative side. It's also a good thing to have surplus because the Constitution limits you to 5 areas where you can spend it, all of which are important. Put 25% in the rainy day, 10% for the unfunded accrued liability on the pension system, and then you can use it for things like the non-federal match for transportation infrastructure like we talked about in the previous question. That is exactly how we're getting the $76 million that's being reallocated to the state of Louisiana, as was announced a week ago today. But you can also pay debt with it as well and do capital construction projects. So the surplus is much better than a deficit. It is about 1% of the budget is what's represented by $300 million. And we need to maintain the stability. This is how we have made our first net new investment in education in a decade, whether it's the K through 12 block grant portion of the funding formula, the teacher pay raise, the early childhood, the new investment we're making in higher education. Had we not done the hard work that we did early on in my administration, we wouldn't have been in a position to make those investments. So in the fiscal session next year, the number one priority will be to maintain the status quo with respect to making sure that the revenue is there to continue to make these investments. Secondly, I would just add real quickly that, well, I see that I'm out of time. I won't do that. Thank you. Well, I don't hear as much about a constitutional convention now as I did 3 years ago, 4 years ago. And the simple reason is that people believed in the legislature, good government groups, and otherwise, that a constitutional convention addressing budget and revenue would be necessary before we could fix the structural deficit that was plaguing our state. We've been able to demonstrate through the work that we've done in Baton Rouge over the last 3 years that a constitutional convention is not required. We have stabilized the state with changes to revenue and to the way that we budget. What you need is someone who's going to budget honestly, without smoke and mirrors, without all the gimmicks. Somebody who isn't going to put in non-recurring dollars for recurring expenditures. The budget I inherited when I walked into the office had $850 million of one-time money against recurring expenditures. We have proposed exactly $0 that were non-recurring against recurring expenditures. So we don't need a constitutional convention. If we were to do one, I would give it some consideration if it could be limited to only those articles of the Constitution that would deal with budget and revenue. We don't need to go out and debate, for example, higher ed governance or the right to hunt and fish in Louisiana. And there's a real question among legal scholars as to whether it's permissible to have a limited constitutional convention. And I would want a definite answer to that before we would call one, because the people of Louisiana and the delegates need to know what the scope of work that they would be engaged in before we would ever venture down that path. But it gratifies me to say we did not need a constitutional convention to fix our problems in Louisiana, to get our budget stability, to work through the revenue issues that we had through a balanced approach, by the way, that included cuts in revenue as well as savings. So I'm not proposing or advocating for a constitutional convention at the present time. Yeah, as I've said for many months now, my number one priority for new investment in my second term will be early childhood education. We got a good down payment on that this most recent year when we increased by $20 million the state effort for early childhood education relative to the previous year. And it's important for the reasons that you stated. 80% of a person's brain development happens before the person's 5 years old. So if you wait until that person is 5 years old before you start educating them, it's too late. And quite frankly, we have more than our fair share of kids showing up at school, and we have for generations now in Louisiana, who haven't been read to. They have vocabulary deficits in the thousands of words. They don't know their shapes and their colors and the days of the week and months of the year and those sorts of basic information and knowledge. So having early childhood education funded and universally available, and I'm talking about ages 0 through 3, and then fully funding the waiting list for kids in the LA4 program for pre-K education is critically important. We can do this in a number of ways, one of which is we can redirect dollars that are available but are being spent on other programs that are not as beneficial as early childhood education. But we're going to do this in my second term. It is a priority of mine. I have stated that for months, and we made good on a down payment this most recent year in order to get us moving the ball in that direction. Well, first of all, we're doing much better, and it's a great question. It didn't just stabilize. We worked really, really hard to stabilize the funding for higher education. It had been cut deeper than any other state in the 8 years before I became governor. Tuition increased more than any other state in the nation. That's what jeopardized the TOPS program when it became so expensive. But today, we actually made the first net new investment in higher education in a decade. The TOPS program is fully funded, and GO grants, the need-based aid for higher education, is funded at an all-time high. Education is synonymous with opportunity. And you create opportunity by instilling confidence in the decision makers, whether they're already in Louisiana, elsewhere around the country, around the world, that if they invest in Louisiana, create a presence or expand their presence here, they're going to have the educated, skilled, trained workers they need to be successful. That is how we have landed those 165 major economic development projects that I spoke of, because we're less concerned with giving incentives directly to the companies than we are in giving money to our community and technical colleges and our four-year universities, and have them deliver the talent necessary for these companies to be successful. And we do that in conjunction with the companies, where they sit and tell us what they need their workers to be able to know and to do. And then we develop a curriculum, and that's what we train on, and then we guarantee success on day one. That formula works. And I believe we have to continue to invest in higher education. I think you just saw where LSU this year, the Wall Street Journal, moved them up considerably from where they were on the list of institutions of higher education across the country. And all of that movement happened in the last 3 years. Not coincidence. It's because of the work that we're doing. But we're also doing it with BIPSI and Northwestern and LSU Shreveport and all the other higher education institutions in the area too, including Tech and Grambling. What we need to do is move towards a funding formula for higher education where about half the money comes from the state and about half the money comes from the student and the family. 10 years ago, it was 30% from the student and 70% from the state. Because of all the changes that happened in the 8 years before I became governor, that was inverted. And now 70% of all the support for higher education comes from the student and his or her family, and only 30% from the state. So holding tuition where it is, increasing over time as we're able to do our investment in higher education, will get that funding mix to 50-50. That's where I think we ought to be. That way higher education will be affordable, because it is synonymous with opportunity. But if you price it out of reach, it's just not available to people, and there is no opportunity. First of all, the state has taken a number of steps over recent years in order to make sure that the unfunded accrued liability in our pension system gets paid off, which is the most important thing, because these benefits are constitutionally guaranteed to the employees who earn them. That happened foremost in 1988 in an amendment to the Constitution that requires the unfunded accrued liability to be paid off over 40 years. Unfortunately, it didn't create a level payment plan, and the legislature for a long time paid an artificially low amount. But we're actually on the backside of that curve and coming down now in the sense of how much we're having to pay. In fact, it was just a couple of years ago that we actually got to where we were paying the principal on that amount. But we've made it much harder for us to move to any system that has an actuarial cost, which means making any changes to the existing systems that cost more than the current systems. We do need to remember that state employees, school teachers do not get Social Security. And we're required by law, because of the agreement we reached with the federal government when we opted out of Social Security, that we would have a Social Security equivalent benefit. And so we have to make sure that our workers have security and dignity in retirement, that their pension benefit is the equivalent of Social Security. And if we can come up with any changes, for example, a cash balance plan that is a hybrid between the defined benefits and plan that we have today, or the defined payments, we can do that. I just want to make sure that it doesn't come at the expense of those individuals who actually do stay for 20 or 30 years. Their benefit shouldn't be reduced. There should not be an actuarial cost associated with that change either. But we can do that, and I believe create a plan that would be optional for people if they come to work for the state, that would allow for more mobility. Because we do know that the current generation of workers will move much more frequently between employers than those that came before them. So I'm open to that under those parameters. Well, first of all, we need to deal with the facts as they are. We have the 5th lowest combined state and local tax burden in the country. That was the ranking we had when I became governor. That's the ranking today. What we have to do is make sure that everything we do makes sense and that we're delivering our commitments to the people of Louisiana. Well, I will tell you where we've made significant progress on those rankings. When I became governor, had one of the highest percentages of people without insurance in our state's history. Today we have the lowest in our state's history. It's about 1 in 10 working age adults. It was 1 in 4 when I became governor. I will tell you that we're no longer the nation's leading incarcerator, a title that we had, a distinction that we had for decades. We're doing much better as a result of changes that we made, where we're not only saving money and reinvesting money, but we're actually safer as a result of that as well. And we are improving with respect to the amount of economic development we're getting in the state of Louisiana. We're #1 in the country for foreign direct investment on a per capita basis in Louisiana, critically important. We have the nation's very best workforce development training program in Fast Start. There are a number of areas where we're doing quite well, and I will never say that we don't have challenges, because we do. But I will tell you the state is in a much stronger position today relative to where we were 4 years ago to meet those challenges and to continue to move forward. I mentioned a while ago where LSU, our flagship university, over the past 3 years on the rankings that came out from the Wall Street Journal, moved up in those rankings considerably. More movement than they have ever seen before. That is very positive for our state. And by the way, the role that higher education is playing across the state, I believe, is extremely important and performing quite well, given the fact that the total amount of investment per student is still among the lowest in the country. And I will tell you, you need to be careful of rankings out there that use data that's as old as 2014, 2015, 2016 in order to form their rankings, because we've seen that quite often. But with the stability we have in the state of Louisiana, with the 11-year record low unemployment that we have, with the highest amount of personal income in the history of our state that we're experiencing right now, with GDP, the size of our economy, the largest it has ever been, our rankings are improving every single day around the state of Louisiana. Yeah. Well, first of all, I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I'm humbled to be asked to come back again. I did this 4 years ago, and be able to share my ideas. I told the people of Louisiana, in Northwest Louisiana, in the Shreveport Chamber 4 years ago, what I would do as governor. We have been able to deliver on those promises. We are in a much better place today than we were 4 years ago by just about every measure that means anything. And I want to thank the people of the Chamber and the business community across the state of Louisiana, because without your help, without your contributions every single day, it just wouldn't happen. But I'm going to continue to work hard for all of Louisiana, and here in Northwest Louisiana, that's particularly bearing fruit in a commitment I made with respect to the medical school. I said we would leave it in Shreveport, that we would stabilize it and strengthen it over time. The most recent class entered with 150 students, an increase of 20 students from before. We've been able to recruit 100 faculty members to the medical school in the past year. We've committed $100 million to capital construction on the campus of the medical school. $60 million for a new medical education building, $40 million to be put into the old St. Mary facility from Christus Schumpert that was donated to the medical school. So this demonstrates that commitment, and the medical school is stronger today than it has been in many, many years because of a lot of hard work that we put into it, and quite frankly because of the new partnership we have at the University Hospital with Oxnard that is performing very well in delivering top quality care out of that hospital as well. I'm going to continue to work for Northwest Louisiana also to promote it around the country, as I've already done, as the cyber corridor, the I-20 cyber corridor. I brought all 50 states, had delegations here at a conference in May that was sponsored by the National Governors Association that I put together to bring to Shreveport-Bossier so they could see the Cyber Innovation Center and the National Cyber Research Park. They could see the curriculum that we've developed that has now become the gold standards, not just in colleges, but in high schools and middle schools and elementary schools all across the country to teach STEM and cyber and computer science. We're going to continue to move forward in this area, and we're going to make sure our universities have the resources necessary to produce the educated graduates who can take advantage of the opportunities in these fields. Pretty soon, Louisiana Tech is going to have more cyber engineering graduates than any other any other university in the country. But we're doing things with BIPSI and Grambling as well. So my commitment is to continue to do what we've been doing and continue to move Louisiana forward, and certainly that includes Northwest Louisiana.